Hi everybody, welcome to the very last lecture of the year for medical microbiology. Today's topic is the pathogens and infections of the genitourinary tract. So in other words, we're going to be talking about urinary tract infections and sexually transmitted infections. So UTIs and STIs. We're going to start with the urinary tract, cover the basics of the anatomy and defenses, and then we'll talk about one urinary tract pathogen, E. coli. So the urinary tract includes, from the outside of the body in, the urethra, which is where urine is exported outside of the body. The bladder is the portion of the urinary tract that stores urine. And so a bladder infection and a urinary tract infection are relatively synonymous, except urinary tract infections can ascend and infect the ureters and the kidneys. So the kidneys are the organs, they're located in your lower back region. These are the organs where our urine is formed by filtering out the blood that passes through the kidneys every day. So urine is formed in the kidneys, urine moves down the ureters to the bladder, and then it exits the body out the urethra. So a bladder infection will be much less serious than an ascending infection, which will reach the kidneys. Where do we find microbes in the urinary tract? We should find microbes only in the urethra. Everything else should be sterile. The urine itself is sterile as it's formed in the kidneys and moves through the bladder to the urethra. So urine is a sterile liquid until it reaches the urethra or the microbes that are found in the urethra. Okay, so a urinary tract infection can be an infection of any of these three portions of the urinary tract, the bladder infection being the most simple form. When we look at what urine is, it's a lot of salts like sulfate, chloride, magnesium, some sodium and potassium. And then we have our nitrogenous waste products, including uric acid and mostly urea. So urea is the final breakdown product of some of our nitrogen-containing proteins. Instead of the proteins being broken down to form ammonia, because ammonia is pretty toxic, our body stores that nitrogen in an organic form called urea. So urea is the primary nitrogenous waste product, but it is organic and it is something that microbes can use as a carbon and energy source and a nitrogen source. So if you look at the color of urine, it looks fairly similar to a broth culture in a test tube. And for some microbes, urine can actually make a fairly good growth medium. And the number one component, of course, is water. Everything else in urine is water soluble. The primary defense of the urinary tract infection is going to be urination itself. Urination is a flushing mechanism. Not only does it flush out microbes attached to the epithelial cells lining our urinary tract, it also sheds the epithelial cells itself. So urination gets rid of the outer surface cells of the urinary tract, so any microbes that might have attached there will also shed along with it. Urine is also fairly acidic, so that's another first-line defense mechanism. There are antibacterial proteins found in urine, like lysozyme. We've covered lysozyme quite a bit in the first, third, and fourth units. Lysozyme is that antimicrobial enzyme that breaks down peptidoglycan cell walls. And then another way that the urinary tract defends against pathogens I'm going to start by saying that most of the pathogens come from the gastrointestinal tract. And the cells that line the urinary tract have different attachment sites. So most microbes from the GI tract won't be able to attach to the urinary tract because of those different attachment sites. And as I've mentioned previously, we should find microbes only in the urethra. And the microbes are usually a mixture of non-pathogenic and non-hemolytic species of gram-positive bacteria. All right, our primary urinary tract infection is E. coli. This is distinct from the E. coli we mentioned in the GI tract lecture. This is not the enterohemorrhagic strain or that E. coli 0157H7. This is just regular E. coli. And regular E. coli is a good part of the GI tract, but we want to make sure it doesn't get into the urinary tract. So it's just regular E. coli that finds its way into the urinary tract. All right, E. coli itself is gram-negative, so that means it has a thin peptidoglycan cell wall with an outer membrane that includes lipopolysaccharide / endotoxin. And as mentioned, it's a very common GI tract microbe. In terms of transmission, we'll start with that because we've already mentioned it comes from the GI tract. So it's endogenous transmission. We get the infection from ourselves. So let's say this is the urethra. The front of the body is facing this way. If this is the urethra, then the anus would be behind it. And so this space right here is moist. This is a female body. So if microbes can kind of swim their way over to the urethra and then swim their way up using their flagella, then that type of infection could cause an ascending urinary tract infection. So microbes can swim across the skin surface from the anus to the urethra, or they can be pushed in that direction, either by wiping in the wrong direction after defecation or through sexual contact. So urinary tract infections are not sexually transmitted infections, but they often will occur after sex because of the mixing of the microbes that occur between the anus and the urethra. So one reason that females are more prone to urinary tract infections than males is because there's a greater distance between the anus and the urethra in males versus females. All right, so you get a urinary tract infection. What are the symptoms? The number one symptom is a frequent urge to urinate. So you have to pee a lot. The urine might turn cloudy as growth occurs with the bacteria in the bladder. And if there's any tissue damage, that could cause some bleeding. And so the urine could have an orange or a red color to it. One thing I'd like to point out, E. coli is the primary cause of UTIs, the most common cause of UTIs, but all causes, no matter what, are going to be bacterial. So there are no viral urinary tract infections. There are no fungal urinary tract infections or protozoan. All bladder infections and UTIs are going to be bacterial, and therefore they should always be treated with an antibiotic. Because if this endotoxin gets into the bloodstream, then that can cause endotoxic shock, or it can cause the infection to become septic. In addition to endotoxin, you can see in this picture here that E. coli has fimbriae, which are numerous pili that extend off the surface of the cell. They aid in attachment to surfaces, and in this case, the attachment is to the epithelial cells that are lining the urinary tract. To prevent urinary tract infections, frequent urination, don't hold your bladder, and urinating after sex is also a good way to flush out any microbes that might have gotten into the urinary tract, as well as proper hygiene. So again, if you, after defecation, make sure you wipe properly in the correct direction, backwards, away from the vagina and the urethra. Antibiotics are the way to treat urinary tract infections. There is a risk that the infection will be caused by antibiotic-resistant bacteria. If this is the case, the antibiotic won't work. Your doctors or nurses would take a culture and test those cultures for antibiotic resistance and susceptibility using that Kirby-Bauer assay, and a proper antibiotic could be prescribed. Complications of urinary tract infections include those ascending infections that would reach the kidneys. And also, urinary tract infections can be caused in hospital settings. And so nosocomial, which means hospital acquired, they can be caused by catheters that are put into the urethra. And if biofilms form on these catheters, they can cause a really difficult to treat urinary tract infection. And many of these nosocomial UTIs are associated with multi-drug resistant bacteria. So in Unit 3, we learned about the nightmare bacteria, which were called the carbapenem resistant Enterobacteriaceae. And E. coli is of that family, Enterobacteriaceae. All right, moving on to the reproductive system, or the genital tract. I'm going to just highlight some of the anatomical regions that could be infected. In males, the outermost exposure to the body would be the urethra. So in males, the urinary tract shares the same exit to the body as the genital tract, or the reproductive system. If you start from the innermost portion, the testes is where sperm are produced, and they are stored and matured in the epididymis. If the epididymis becomes infected, it can cause a lot of scarring, and males can become sterile or infertile if infections reach the epididymis. And then further along, we have the prostate gland and the vas deferens, which secrete the fluids necessary for sperm to eject out of the urethra. So any infection that reaches the vas deferens, prostate gland, and epididymis will be more serious than an infection of the urethra. In females, egg production occurs in the ovaries, and eggs are released into the fallopian tubes or the uterine tubes. You may have heard the term fallopian tube used more commonly. And in the uterine tubes, this is where egg fertilization usually occurs. Eggs then travel into the uterus, and after about 8 to 9 to 12 days, the embryo will implant into the lining of the uterus. The cervix is a tissue layer. It's a connective tissue layer separating the uterus, which should be sterile, from the vagina. So in the female reproductive system, the vagina is the only place that should have microbes. And microbes like to attach to surfaces, and so the cervix is a common site for infection. There can be vaginal infections, and there can be infections that reach the uterus and the uterine tubes. Those would be much more dangerous than an infection of the vagina. In terms of defenses, they're going to be a little bit different in males versus females because of the different anatomical structures. Females have a lot of mucus secretions coming from the cells that line the vagina, and that mucus keeps microbes moving outward. There's also antimicrobial peptides found in mucus. And the vagina itself has a relatively acidic pH because of the lactic acid bacteria that form lactic acid from fermentation. And one of those strains of lactic acid bacteria is lactobacillus. So lactobacillus is a healthy component of the women's reproductive system. All right, and the males will have the same defenses as the urinary tract since they share the same parts. Same thing with the microbiome. The microbiome is going to be a little bit different. For the male's urinary tract, it's going to be similar to the skin that's found on the outer surface of the penis. So there will be many microbes in the urethra coming from the skin. As we move on to the pathogens of the reproductive system, this is an introductory slide that comes from the CDC, or the Center for Disease Control. One question that I get a lot is, what's the difference between an STD and an STI? So ST stands for sexually transmitted, D stands for disease, and I stands for infection. So STIs are STDs. The main way that we use the term differently is that STIs are often treatable with antibiotics, whereas a full-blown STD is something that you might not be able to get rid of with antibiotics. But oftentimes the terms are going to be used interchangeably. Our top STIs in the United States for bacterial infections are going to be chlamydia, gonorrhea, and syphilis. While chlamydia is number one in terms of the prevalence or abundance of cases, you'll notice that gonorrhea and syphilis are increasing more rapidly than cases of chlamydia. And also cases of newborn syphilis is also on the rise as well. So we're going to start with chlamydia. Chlamydia is an infection caused by the bacterium Chlamydia trachomatis. It is a gram-negative bacterium. It doesn't form capsules, but it will have endotoxin because of its nature, having that outer membrane. And it's an intracellular parasite, which means the chlamydia hides out in our own cells, as opposed to being attached to the surface of our cells. So these pathogens can be harder to treat or require longer antibiotic treatment because the antibiotics have to get through our cells and then also into the chlamydia cells themselves. The name of the infection is chlamydia, and as I've mentioned before, it is the number one reported bacterial STI in the country. Not number one overall, that will belong to HPV, which we'll talk about later in this lecture. HPV, of course, is a viral infection. So let me tell you a little bit more about chlamydia. Chlamydia causes symptoms more often in females than males. Most males are asymptomatic, but for those that do experience symptoms, the number one symptom will be urethritis, which is when the urethra is infected and inflamed. So these infections can result in the urethra infection in males or a cervix infection in females, but they can also ascend and go further into the body In males, the infection can spread to the epididymis, and if it does that, there could be scarring of the epididymis and the sperm ducts, like the vas deferens, and this scarring can result in permanent sterility. In females, more experienced symptoms, but still it's noteworthy that 75% of females do not experience symptoms. So asymptomatic means doesn't experience symptoms. And so the cervix is the #1 spot for infection. There will be excess mucus and discharge with a chlamydia infection. And if that infection goes into the uterus and the uterine tubes, then the infection is what is known as pelvic inflammatory disease, or PID. So this is when the uterus and uterine tubes or fallopian tubes become infected, and the scarring of the uterine tubes can lead to infertility and also ectopic pregnancies, or even anaerobic infections. So I've got a picture right here showing some of that. So again, the cervix will be the location for most infections. If the infection reaches the uterus, that's not a good thing, but even worse are the fallopian tubes. They are very, very narrow. So even a little bit of inflammation or scarring can have some serious effects. So if the scar tissue builds up, oxygen might have a hard time reaching some of the tissues. Infections can become anaerobic, or a fertilized embryo might not be able to reach the uterus. So if it gets blocked up, that's what's called a tubal or an ectopic pregnancy. So a lot of complications with pelvic inflammatory disease caused by a chlamydia infection. All right, so I have a lot of epidemiology graphs. We're just going to kind of take away the take-home message from this. In this chart right here, we see that women have more reported infections than men. That would be one trend that we see over a period of time from 2000 to 2017. The other trend that we see is that infections are increasing for both male and female. And the reason why, there are two reasons why females might report more infections. One reason could be more regular screening due to yearly pap smears. Oftentimes when you go in for a pap smear, doctors will automatically do a swab of the cervix and do some culture from that swab. In addition to looking for irregular cervical cells, they'll look for bacterial infections as well. And then the other reason might be they might be more likely to experience symptoms. So the increase in cases, reported cases in females compared to males, may be a reflection of these things rather than males not having the infection. In our next graph, we're going to see the statewide prevalence. So these rates are reported per 100,000 individuals in a population. And so the number of cases per 100,000 individuals is the epidemiology statistic that we call prevalence. Okay, so you can see that chlamydia infections are more prevalent in southern states. And here in Michigan, 510 out of every 100,000 individuals will test positive in a single year for chlamydia. This graph shows the statistics by age group. You can see that the highest risk groups are going to be those between the ages, if you combine these, between the ages of 15 and 24. Upper 20s still are at risk, and then the risk goes down as you get older, and then this number of cases right here is total. When I first looked at this graph, I thought that was really, really old people, and I was like, okay, but it's not. It's the total average amongst all age groups. All right, so we see infections in males and females following similar trends, with the highest risk being those that are aged 15 to 24. And sadly, if you look at the data, there are a number of cases reported amongst both males and females in younger age groups between 10 and 14. I'm going to take this moment right now to mention that as we move through more of the slides, some images might be disturbing, some of the data and the facts might be a trigger. If you experience any discomfort, feel free to mute, fast forward, or close your eyes. All right. Again, 1.8 million cases of chlamydia in the United States. It is transmitted through sexual contact, but also through neonatal contact, meaning a fetus can get it from its mother during incubation. The only prevention for chlamydia is the use of a physical barrier. That physical barrier can be a condom during sex or no contact. Having a trusted partner where communication is key is also a good preventative mechanism. Because it's a bacterial infection, it can be treated with antibiotics. Because of the potential for microbes to hide away from the antibiotics in our own host cells, doctors will usually screen for the infection after the course of antibiotics is taken to make sure that the infection has been cleared. Chlamydia infections can be long-term or chronic and difficult to treat. All right, here we go with a slide. Again, it's a little sad. Neonatal contact. So babies that are born to those with chlamydia have a higher risk of trachoma. And that's actually how the species Chlamydia trachomatis got its name, is because of the eye infections that are much more visible than the genital infection. So this is an infectious eye disease, and there are over 100,000 cases per year. So this underscores that many cases are not diagnosed. If they were, they would be treated, and then we wouldn't see this. And trachoma is a serious infection that can lead to blindness. Chlamydia can also get into the lungs of babies, and so this can cause infant pneumonia. All right, we're going to move on now to gonorrhea. Gonorrhea is a gram-negative bacterium. We've seen Neisseria before when we talked about meningitis. And so, like Neisseria meningitidis, Neisseria gonorrhea is also a gram-negative bacterium that forms diplococci cells. So diplococci would be the cell morphology. And they are also capsule-forming, like Neisseria meningitidis. And again, because it's gram-negative, it does have lipopolysaccharide or endotoxin. And it causes gonorrhea, which is colloquially what we call the clap. And so if you've ever wondered why the clap is called the clap, there are several suggested etymological origins of the term. The first is a reference to a treatment that was used to clear the pus in the urethra. So the urethra would get blocked with that pus, and then sometimes a book would be used to kind of clap the penis on both sides, causing that blockage to clear. One other reference to that, to the clap would be the painful sting, which feels like the sting of your hands clapping. And probably the most common one is the French word clapier, means brothel. So that's likely the origin of the word, the clap. All right. Gonorrhea infections can be very similar to chlamydia infections in terms of their symptoms. One thing that is different, though, is in males, there's going to be a yellow discharge. I don't know if I mentioned this verbally, But in chlamydia infections, there's a clear discharge, and that is because of the intracellular infection. So we have clear discharge with chlamydia infections, but gonorrhea is not an intracellular organism, so the organisms, the culture of the Neisseria itself will come out with the discharge. So chlamydia infections have a clear discharge in males, whereas gonorrhea infections have a yellowish colored discharge. Males are more likely to experience symptoms. Only 10% of males are asymptomatic. So that means that most males will experience these symptoms, which is infection of the urethra, which causes painful urination, and again, that yellow discharge. If the infection spreads to the prostate and epididymis, this can result in scarring of the sperm ducts or the vas deferens, and this will result in sterility or the inability to have sex that results in a pregnancy. Females are more likely to be asymptomatic. About half of females are asymptomatic. And so still, this is more than with a chlamydia infection. Females will experience mucus and pus-containing discharge. It could be bleeding and painful urination. There's because if the infection reaches the uterus and uterine tubes, this can also cause pelvic inflammatory disease, which will result in either or infertility and or the possibility for ectopic pregnancies and anaerobic infections. Okay, so we saw a peak in gonorrhea cases during the war years, likely due to soldiers visiting brothels. It has decreased since then, but since 2010 has been increasing again. All right, you can see in this graph that in the most recent years, more men have reported cases than females. But again, this could be due to the fact that more men will experience symptoms, or a higher percent of men will experience symptoms. And you don't see as big of a difference as we did with chlamydia, but females are going to be somewhat close in terms of rates of reported infections because of their being more likely to be screened due to yearly pap smears. All right, rates of infection are lower for gonorrhea than for chlamydia, but the geographic prevalence is fairly similar. So southern states have higher rates of gonorrhea infections, and Michigan has a prevalence value of 159 individuals out of every 100,000. The trend of age group, number of cases reported by age group is similar, with those being 15 to 24 having the highest risk of gonorrhea infections as well as chlamydia infections. All right. In addition to lipopolysaccharide, gonorrhea is also a capsule-forming bacteria, and it also forms fimbriae. So this picture right here shows that extracellular sticky layer, which is the capsule, and the fimbriae are the appendages that are used to attach to the surfaces of our epithelial cells. And you can see that attachment in this electron micrograph right here. Gonorrhea infections have several complications. They can occur outside of the genital tract. So gonorrhea infection can infect the eye, causing conjunctivitis, or it can infect the throat, causing pharyngitis. The infections can also spread or disseminate. So they can spread to other parts of the body and infect joints or even skin. And babies born to those that have a gonorrhea infection can also come down with those eye infections, similar to what we saw with chlamydia. All right, 500,000 cases per year. we have an increased risk of rate of increase in gonorrhea infections compared to chlamydia. Transmission and prevention is the same. Sexual contact, neonatal contact, and prevention through physical barriers or no contact. Treating gonorrhea, it uses antibiotics. However, antibiotic resistance is a very big issue right now. So isolates of gonorrhea are required to be reported to the CDC, and then the isolates are also screened. It should be screened, not screens, for their antibiotic resistance. So I'm going to show you a few charts over the years. You can see that in 2015, 60% of all gonorrhea isolates were susceptible to all antibiotics tested. So what that means is you could treat 60% of gonorrhea isolates with any antibiotic and it would work. But about 40% were resistant to one or more antibiotics. And in this one right here is the multi-drug resistant gonorrhea that's resistant to penicillin, tetracycline, and one of the quinolone drugs. QRNG stands for quinolone resistant Neisseria gonorrhea. All right, so just about 6% are multi-drug resistant, 60% are susceptible to all antibiotics tested. And then in the next year, 56% of all isolates were susceptible to all antibiotics tested, with roughly the same amount being multi-drug resistant. And now in 2017, 51% of isolates are susceptible to all antibiotics. So the trend that we're seeing is fewer strains every year are susceptible to all antibiotics that are tested. All right, so we've covered our bacterial STIs. We're now going to move on to one of our viral causes of an STI. I do want to take a moment to bring up another one. You won't be tested on this, but HPV and herpes are two different things. So I want to point out that herpes simplex virus, the HSV2, is associated with genital herpes, whereas herpes simplex virus 1 is associated with cold sores. However, herpes simplex 1 can also cause genital sores as well. So herpes is one type of viral sexually transmitted disease. The most common one, though, is HPV. And HPV stands for human papilloma virus. And these, in a very general way, cause warts. Most strains of HPV cause hand and foot warts or warts on the skin. But there are 120 strains total of HPV, and a handful of strains are genital strains. So they can cause infections like genital warts or even be associated with cervical cancer. The ones that are termed the high-risk strains, these are the ones associated with cancers. The ones that cause genital warts, they might not be a fun time, but they are not going to be the ones that cause cervical cancers. All right, so many strains cause genital warts. The high-risk strains are the leading cause of cervical cancers and contribute to other types of cancers as well. So if you look at this graph right here, on the x-axis, we have the number of cases worldwide. So you can see that cervical cancer far outnumbers even mouth and throat cancer and cancer of the anus, vagina, or penis. And the other notable trend is that only a small proportion of mouth and throat cancers are caused by HPV, as you can see with this red bar compared to the gray bar. Most mouth and throat cancers would likely be caused by tobacco. With cervical cancer, almost 100% of cases are caused by HPV. And so this makes cervical cancer entirely preventable with a vaccine, since almost all cases are caused by viruses. There is no cure for cervical cancer, but again, there is a vaccine which can prevent cervical cancer caused by high-risk HPV strains. All right, and if you look at the prevalence of genital warts, you can see that the prevalence has increased over time, whereas the prevalence of the high-risk HPV strains have gone down over time, presumably due to the vaccines for these high-risk strains. All right. Our last pathogen of the lecture and of the year is called Trichomonas vaginalis. As the name suggests, it causes an infection of the vagina. Trichomonas is a protozoan, so it's a eukaryote that doesn't have a cell wall, and all organisms are single-celled. You can also see it's a flagellate, so flagellates are one of the 4 types of protozoa, and they are motile via flagella. It is the causative, I spelled causative wrong, causative agent, or the pathogen that causes trichomoniasis. I also spelled trichomoniasis wrong. Trichomoniasis is a vaginal infection, so more generally it could be called vaginosis or vaginitis. It is a sexually transmitted infection, and up to 70% of individuals, both male and female, are asymptomatic. So because it's caused by a protozoa, it can be treated with that antibiotic that is effective against some protozoa called metronidazole. And you can see that the prevalence of trichomonas is fairly steady. Maybe it's decreased somewhat, but I do want to point out that there are bacterial causes of vaginosis as well, and not all are sexually transmitted. So it is possible to just get a regular vaginal infection that is not from sexual contact. All right, that is it for the pathogens of the genitourinary tract and for the semester of medical microbiology. I'd like to end this lecture by thanking you all for sticking with me through this semester. It's been tough on all of us, and I'm really proud of you for everything that you've done and showing perseverance during this difficult time. I'd also like to thank you all in advance for the hard work that you are going to be doing in your professions. I know that most of you are going into the healthcare field. Many of you are pre-nursing majors. And again, I just want to thank you in advance for the very important work that you are going to be doing. Good luck. Hope you have a really great final exam week. And I hope to see you all sometime soon. Take care.